There is a town in the middle of England where, if you had walked into any pub on a Saturday afternoon in the 1960s, you would have sworn you had somehow crossed the border into Scotland. The accents were Glaswegian and Ayrshire. The football rivalry was not local at all. It was Rangers against Celtic, played out with total sincerity, 400 miles from Glasgow. There was a Robert Burns Appreciation Society. There were churches built for the Church of Scotland. There was, and still is, a Highland Gathering every summer, with pipe bands and cabers tossed on an English village green. And to this day, one supermarket in this one English town sells more bottles of Urn Brew than any other store in the whole of England. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened slowly. In 1931, this was a village of about 1,500 people, a scatter of cottages around a few quarries, the kind of place that does not appear on most maps of England at all. Within 30 years, it was a booming industrial town of tens of thousands, one of the largest steelworks in the whole of Europe, roaring at its centre, and it had been built, quite literally, by a single company, to make a single product, and staffed very deliberately by workers imported wholesale from the declining steel towns of Scotland. One company built this entire town from nothing, and on a single day in 1980, that same company effectively ended it. 11,000 jobs disappeared inside 2 years. Unemployment in the town rocketed to nearly a third of the entire adult population, the worst in the whole of Britain. And that was not even the cruelest thing this town's steelworks would do to it. Decades later, in the quiet years after the furnaces went cold, something buried in the ground here began to hurt children who had not even been born when the works closed. This is Corby, Northamptonshire. How does one company build an entire English town from a handful of cottages, populate it with thousands of Scottish families it deliberately recruited, and then bury the whole thing in the space of a single announcement? This is the rise and fall of Corby. To understand how a village of 1,500 people became, and then unbecame, one of the great steel towns of Europe, you have to go back to the one thing that made this particular patch of Northamptonshire worth building anything on at all. Because there is no ancient port here, no royal charter, no medieval cathedral, none of the centuries-deep foundations that most English towns can point to. There is only rock, buried in the clay beneath ordinary farmland, and what one company eventually decided to do with it. Beneath the fields around the village of Corby ran a broad seam of ironstone, a lower-grade iron ore than the famous deposits of the north of England, but present in truly enormous quantities and lying close enough to the surface to be quarried rather than mined deep underground with shafts and cages. Local landowners had known about it for generations, geological surveys noting the seam as early as the middle of the 19th century, though for a long time nobody thought it worth the trouble of extracting at any real scale. Small-scale quarrying had gone on quietly since the early 1880s. A business named Lloyds Ironstone Company, working the ground around the village, with a handful of pits and a modest workforce, its output trickling out by rail to feed other people's furnaces elsewhere in the country, in the Midlands and further afield. It was modest, unglamorous, small-scale work, the kind of quiet rural industry that leaves barely a mark on a place. Nobody standing in Corby village in 1900, watching a handful of men working a quarry on the edge of the fields, would have guessed even faintly at what was coming, or how completely it would remake everything around them within a single working lifetime. What changed everything was a merger. In 1930, the Scottish steel and tube-making firm of Stewarts, based around the declining steel towns of the Clyde Valley, joined forces with the English ironstone concern, already working the ground at Corby, to form a new company, Stewarts and Lloyds. It is worth pausing on that name, because it is already, in miniature, the whole story of this town. A Scottish steel firm and an English ironstone firm, merging to exploit an English seam using Scottish expertise, and within a few short years, that same marriage would repeat itself on a human scale, family by family, all across the town. And in 1933, that new company made the single decision that created the modern town. They chose Corby as the site for an enormous new integrated steelworks, one that would mine the local ore, smelt it, and roll it directly into steel tube, all on one site, at a scale nobody in this part of England had ever attempted. The ambition of the build itself tells you everything about what this company was capable of and what it expected of the ground beneath Corby. To strip away the earth covering the ironstone at the speed the new works demanded, engineers designed and built colossal walking dragline excavators, machines the size of small buildings that crept across the Northamptonshire countryside on enormous mechanical feet, tearing up the overburden in single bites the size of a house. Locals who remembered them said you could hear the great engines groaning from streets away, and see the machines themselves lumbering across the horizon like something out of an entirely different age of the world, silhouetted against the sky at dusk as they crawled from one working face to the next, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent to the quiet farmland they were reshaping mile by mile. It was, quite deliberately, industrial ambition on a scale designed to overwhelm. Stewarts and Lloyds had a problem, moving mountains of earth cheaply enough to make low-grade ore profitable, and their answer was simply to build a machine bigger than the problem, and then another, until the whole landscape for miles around the town bore the scars of their passing. And then came the part of the plan that would remake the town more completely than any blast furnace ever could. A steelworks this size needed thousands of skilled men, and there were not thousands of skilled steelworkers living quietly in the fields of rural Northamptonshire waiting to be discovered. So Stewarts and Lloyds went and got them, deliberately, systematically, treating the recruitment of an entire workforce as carefully as it had treated the engineering of the plant itself. As the company closed or ran down older, smaller plants it owned in Scotland, in Lanarkshire, and around the declining steel towns of the Clyde, it did not simply make those workers redundant and wish them well. It offered them a specific, concrete deal, the kind that was hard for a man with a family and a fading trade to refuse. Come to Corby, and there is a job waiting for you at the new works, and there is a house waiting for you too. Whole families, and in time whole streets of families, packed up their lives in Scotland and moved to a building site in the English Midlands on the strength of that promise. Many came from towns whose own steel and iron trades were themselves fading, men who had grown up expecting to work the same trade their fathers had, only to find the work drying up on the Clyde, just as an entirely new works was rising 200 miles to the south, hungry for exactly their skills. By 1938, Stewarts and Lloyds had built some 2,000 houses purely to accommodate the new workforce it had imported. Whole new streets laid out almost as fast as the families arrived to fill them, and the families kept coming through the war and long after it. By 1961, according to the census, more than a third of everyone living in Corby had been born in Scotland. This English town, hundreds of miles south of the border, had become so thoroughly Scottish in its character that people simply started calling it Little Scotland, and the name has never really gone away. You could see the scale of the ambition in the numbers alone. From that scatter of 1,500 souls in the early 1930s, the population reached 10,000 within a handful of years of the works opening, then 18,000 by 1950, when the government formally designated Corby a new town, a status that unlocked yet more investment and yet more building, whole new neighbourhoods of prefabricated and then permanent housing spreading out from the works in every direction, each one filling almost as fast as the concrete could set. By the 1970s, the population stood close to 50,000, in a place that had been a hamlet within living memory of some of the people now living there, a rate of growth that would have been remarkable for any planned town anywhere in the world, let alone one built almost entirely around the fortunes of a single factory. Few towns anywhere in Britain, before or since, have been willed into existence this quickly or this deliberately by the decisions of a single company. Walk through Corby at the height of its confidence, sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and you would have found something genuinely strange and rather wonderful. An entire transplanted Scottish industrial culture, dropped whole into the English Midlands and thriving there, as though a slice of Lanarkshire had simply been lifted up and set down among the fields of Northamptonshire. The football terraces divided, with total seriousness, into Rangers and Celtic support, an entirely Glaswegian rivalry played out by men who now worked side by side on an English shop floor and drank together in the same working men's clubs afterwards, regardless of which end they had stood on that afternoon. The old religious and sectarian lines of the west of Scotland, transplanted wholesale into a Northamptonshire social club, argued over just as fiercely here as they ever had been on Clydeside. There were pipe bands, practicing on scrubby recreation grounds between the new estates, their playing drifting across gardens on a summer evening in a sound that had no business being heard anywhere near the English Midlands. There were churches of Scottish denomination standing among the English parish churches, congregations that had, in some cases, simply relocated wholesale along with their ministers, hymn books and all. Bus routes ran, remarkably, all the way north to the Scottish Highlands, so that families could visit relatives they had left behind without ever needing a car of their own. A coach service that existed for the specific, practical reason that an entire community's roots still lay 400 miles away. A Highland Gathering was established, with caber tossing and massed pipers, and it has been held nearly every year since. An English town in Northamptonshire staging a full Scottish Highland Games, because that is, genuinely, what a huge part of its population actually was. Not a piece of borrowed theming, but a simple, accurate description of the people living there. And underneath all of that transplanted culture, the works themselves grew into something the whole of Europe took notice of. By the time it reached its peak, the Corby Steelworks was the largest plant of its type anywhere on the continent, an integrated site that mined its own ore, smelted its own iron, and rolled its own finished steel tube, employing at its height something close to half of every working adult in the entire town. The skyline of Corby, for the better part of half a century, meant one thing above all else: the great cooling towers and blast furnaces of the works, visible from every approach to the town, their glow lighting the underside of the clouds on winter nights, the shift-change hooter marking the rhythm of daily life for tens of thousands of families, whether they worked inside the gates or simply lived within earshot of them. Across the 46 years of its life, the works at Corby produced almost 30 million tons of steel, tube rolled here, finding its way into gas pipelines and scaffolding and construction projects across the whole of Britain and well beyond it. It mattered to the whole country, not just to the town. During the Second World War, Corby's tube rolling capacity became part of one of the most ingenious engineering projects of the entire conflict, the operation codenamed Pluto, Pipelines Under the Ocean, in which specially made steel tubing was coiled onto enormous floating drums and then unwound along the seabed of the English Channel to supply fuel directly to Allied forces after the D-Day landings, moving well over 100 million gallons of fuel without a single tanker crossing the water and risking German attack. Winston Churchill himself called it a wholly British achievement, a feat of amphibious engineering skill of which the country could well be proud. Some of the pipe that made that possible was rolled in Corby by men and women who had, in many cases, come south from Scotland only a few years before, working shifts around the clock on a project whose true purpose most of them were never told at the time. This was a town, in other words, that believed, with real justification, that it had earned a permanent place in the industrial life of the nation. It had been built by one company from literally nothing, populated deliberately with imported skill and imported loyalty, and it had proved its worth in the country's darkest hour, its tube helping to fuel the very invasion that would end the war. There was every reason, standing in Corby in the middle of the 20th century, watching the furnaces glow against the night sky, and the works hooter call another shift to the gates, to believe that the good times were simply how things were now, and would go on being, for this generation and the ones that followed it. The floor, though, had been built into the town from its very first blueprint, and it was the same floor that undoes every company town this channel has ever traced. Corby did not merely have one major employer. It had, for all practical purposes, exactly one employer, full stop, and the entire town's fortunes rose and fell with a single company's ledger, in a way that a more organically grown town, with a mix of trades built up over centuries, simply never has to risk. Worse, the very thing that had made Corby's steel possible in the first place, its local, low-grade ironstone, was also, in the end, its greatest weakness. Ore of that quality is expensive to process at scale, compared with the high-grade iron ore that could, by the second half of the 20th century, be shipped in cheaply and in bulk from overseas to modern coastal steelworks, built with deep-water docks designed to take the biggest ore carriers afloat. British Steel, formed when the industry was nationalised in 1967, began investing instead in enormous new coastal plants at places like Scunthorpe and Port Talbot that could take that imported high-grade ore straight off giant ships, without the cost and difficulty of clawing it out of the Northamptonshire clay with a fleet of dragline excavators. Corby, landlocked in the Northamptonshire countryside and tied forever to its own increasingly uncompetitive local seam, found itself, quite suddenly, an old-fashioned way of making steel in a world that had moved on to a cheaper one, and there was very little the town itself could do about a decision that was, at bottom, a matter of geography and shipping costs, rather than any failure of the men and women who actually worked the plant. By the late 1970s, the writing was on the wall, and in 1979, British Steel announced what the whole town had been dreading for years, without quite letting themselves believe it. The Corby plant, once the pride of the whole industry and the largest of its kind in Europe, was no longer financially viable, and it would close. For a workforce that had spent 2 generations believing their jobs were as permanent as the ground the works stood on, the announcement landed like a betrayal from within the family, not simply bad economic news from a distant boardroom. If the story of Britain's forgotten places means something to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is one of the few things that keeps a place like this from being forgotten twice. This channel brings the lost history of Britain's great towns and cities back to life, the places that built the modern world and were then quietly left behind by it. Now, back to Corby, where the worst was still to come. The announcement provoked exactly the reaction you would expect from a town this dependent on one decision made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away. There was mass protest. There were marches through the town centre, petitions signed by thousands, delegations of workers and shop stewards sent to plead the case in London, and a genuine, widespread refusal, for a long time, to accept that a plant which had defined 2 full generations of this community could simply be switched off by a memo from head office. Men who had come south from Scotland as young apprentices, and who had expected their own sons to follow them onto the same shop floor, watched that entire inheritance evaporate in the space of a single announcement. It made no difference to the outcome. The closures went ahead through 1979 and into 1980, and the effect on the town was close to total collapse. Somewhere close to 11,000 jobs vanished from Corby within about 2 years, more than 5,000 of them directly from British Steel's own payroll by the end of 1981 alone, in a town whose entire adult population had, within living memory, numbered barely more than that. Unemployment in Corby surged to somewhere around 30% of the working-age population, among the very worst rates recorded anywhere in Britain during that whole brutal era of industrial closures, worse than almost anything being suffered at the same moment in the coalfields of Wales or the shipyards of the Tyne. This was not a gradual decline of the kind that unfolds quietly over a generation, the sort this channel has traced in towns whose single industry withered slowly across decades. This was a town that had been built, whole, by a single company in barely a generation, and was now being unmade by that same company almost as quickly as it had been made, in the space of little more than a single announcement and the 2 grim years that followed it. The population, which had climbed relentlessly for 50 straight years, simply stopped growing and stagnated for the better part of 2 decades. Families who had come south from Scotland for the promise of secure, well-paid, generations-long work now found that promise broken, in a town they had built their entire lives and identity around, hundreds of miles from where most of them had started, and with nothing much waiting for them if they went back. Corby became, in the language of the era, exactly the kind of place the term ghost town was coined to describe, the shuttered shops on its high street and the idle men on its street corners, becoming, for a time, a kind of national shorthand for what deindustrialisation actually looked like on the ground. A single company had built an entire town to serve one product, and when the world no longer wanted that product made this particular way, the company simply walked away and left the town to work out what, if anything, it was for. That would have been tragedy enough on its own, but Corby's story does not end with unemployment, and this is the part that almost nobody outside Northamptonshire has ever heard, because what happened next was not an economic collapse at all. It was a second, much darker wound, inflicted not by the closure itself, but by what was done, carelessly and for years afterwards, in cleaning up after it. Once the works finally shut for good, the enormous site had to be decommissioned, its buildings demolished, its ground reclaimed for new use, a process that began in 1984 and continued for years afterwards under the responsibility of the local council. Millions of tons of material had to be moved off that site, contaminated with decades of industrial residue, including heavy metals such as cadmium, and in the course of that reclamation, lorry after lorry of it was carried out across the town and beyond, to sites that were not properly assessed or managed for the danger they posed, in a process that a High Court judge would later find had been handled with plain, provable negligence. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, mothers living near the reclamation sites began giving birth to children with serious upper limb deformities, missing or malformed fingers and hands, at a rate that a solicitor's later investigation found to be roughly 3 times higher than in the surrounding area. For years, the families affected had no explanation at all, and precious little acknowledgement from the authorities they turned to for one. Some were told, in effect, that it was simply bad luck, a cruel roll of the dice that happened to have landed disproportionately on their own street, their own school catchment, their own small corner of the town. It took a long and difficult legal fight, brought by 18 of those families against Corby Borough Council, before a High Court judge ruled in 2009 that the council had indeed been negligent in the way it managed the toxic waste from the steelworks, in the first ruling of its kind anywhere in Britain to establish a proven legal link between airborne industrial waste and birth defects in children who were never anywhere near the factory floor, born years after the furnaces themselves had gone cold. It was a landmark judgment, and it should, by rights, have closed the story. It did not. In the years since, further families in Corby have come forward describing childhood cancers they believe are linked to the very same contaminated ground, organising themselves into campaign groups representing dozens of affected households, and fighting, so far without full success, simply to get the local council to disclose exactly where all of the toxic waste was actually buried. Requests for a full public inquiry have, as yet, gone unanswered in the way the families want. No one, to this day, has ever been criminally charged over any of it, despite a court finding of clear negligence. The events were dramatised for a wide national audience in the Netflix series Toxic Town, which finally brought Corby's second, quieter tragedy to a kind of recognition that the original steelworks closure itself, for all its economic devastation, never fully received in its own time. So here is the honest reckoning on Corby, and there are, in truth, 2 entirely separate verdicts to deliver, because 2 very different things happened to this town, at 2 different times, for 2 different reasons, and it would be a disservice to both to blur them together into one single story of decline. The closure of the steelworks itself belongs to the same brutal, arguable story as Sheffield's furnaces and Newcastle's coalfields, a genuinely uncompetitive plant, mining low-grade local ore in a world that had moved on to cheap imported ore and modern coastal ports, overtaken by economics that no amount of local loyalty, however fierce, could hold back forever. Defenders of what happened will point out, fairly, that British Steel was hemorrhaging public money across the whole industry by the late 1970s, that Corby's particular combination of inland location and low-grade ore made it one of the least competitive plants in the entire nationalised network, and that propping it up indefinitely would simply have delayed an inevitable reckoning at even greater eventual cost. Reasonable people can and do disagree about how the closure itself was managed, and about whether a different government, with a gentler timetable and more generous transitional support, might have wound the plant down without quite so much devastation landing on one town all at once. But there is no real dispute among historians of the industry that the underlying plant, in its old form, mining ore this way in this location, was not coming back, whoever had been in office. The second wound is not arguable in the same way at all, and it deserves to be judged entirely on its own terms. Whatever the case for closing an uncompetitive steelworks, and however strong that economic case genuinely was, there is no honest defence for negligently scattering its toxic waste around a town full of families and children, and there is no defence at all for the years those families then spent fighting simply to be told the truth about what had been buried near their homes. That was not the impersonal churn of global steel economics, the same faceless forces that closed plants right across Britain in this era. That was a specific, local, avoidable choice made by people with names and job titles about how carefully to treat the ground beneath a community that had already given the company and the country almost everything it had. A recession can be blamed on the world. A negligent cleanup can only ever be blamed on the people who carried it out. And yet, this is not quite where Corby's story ends, because a town built this fast, and this deliberately, on this much collective willpower, turns out to be remarkably hard to finish off. Stand in Corby today, and the steelworks themselves are almost entirely gone, demolished so thoroughly that a visitor could drive past the site and see nothing but ordinary streets and business parks, where Europe's largest steel plant once stood, the dragline excavators long since scrapped, the blast furnaces reduced to rubble and hauled away. A small fragment of the steel industry survives even now, a fraction of its former size, employing perhaps a few hundred people where tens of thousands once worked. But the town itself refused to simply lie down with its old employer. Aided by its designation as a new town, by new road and rail links that finally connected it properly to the motorway network, and by decades of patient, often unglamorous regeneration work, Corby spent the 2000s and 2010s as, by some measures, one of the fastest-growing towns anywhere in Europe, its population climbing back past the numbers it had reached at the height of the steel boom, and then comfortably beyond them, new estates rising on ground that had once been quarry and slag. And little Scotland has never actually disappeared, even now, nearly a century after the first Scottish families arrived to build a steelworks that no longer exists in any recognisable form. The Highland Gathering still fills a Northamptonshire park with pipe bands and caber tossing most summers. The Rangers and Celtic supporters clubs endure, still drawing their crowds to watch matches played 400 miles away on television screens in English clubhouses. That one supermarket, by all local accounts, still sells more Urn brew than any other store in England. A small, stubborn, slightly absurd monument to the fact that an entire Scottish community was picked up and set down here on the strength of a single company's decision, and simply refused, when that company eventually left, to stop being who it had become in the meantime. A village of 1,500 people was turned into a steel town of tens of thousands by one company's ambition, and unmade again by that same company's economics, in less time than it takes most places in this story to fall even partway. What survived, in the end, was never really the steel at all, and it was never really the company either, however much both once defined this place utterly. It was the people the steel had brought here from 400 miles away, and the town, wounded twice over, once by a boardroom decision and once by a negligent cleanup, that they went on quietly building for themselves long after the company that built it for them in the first place had gone for good and taken its name off every door in the town. Somewhere in Corby today, on an ordinary Saturday, a pipe band is probably tuning up in a park that used to be quarry land, and a supermarket shelf somewhere in the town is being restocked with more Urn brew than any equivalent shelf anywhere else in England, and neither of those two small, stubborn facts has anything at all to do with steel anymore. They are simply what was left, in the end, once the furnaces went cold, and the waste was finally, imperfectly, cleared away. A company built a town to make tube. What it actually left behind was a people. If you have walked with this story all the way to the end, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We uncover a different lost British town or city every week, and there are far more of them than you would ever think. The next one is waiting for you on screen right now.